We have a few applicant representatives today, not many, but a few.
Okay. So we're bringing mics to
I don't see that graph on there.
Well, it's just, it's exactly 2 o'clock, so maybe
Yeah.
I'll filter it in the next few minutes.
Well, he's.
Hi, Michelle. Carlo here. If you need me to, are you okay with me staying on, or do you need me to come off first?
No, I'm okay with you staying on.
Okay.
We have a matter on first that's going to be a little bit lengthy, perhaps.
Okay.
And then
Okay.
I can clear yours up right after that, if you like.
Whatever you like, Michelle. I'll follow your schedule or in timing. If you think it'll go past 2:30, I'm going to get Matt Horbatuk to stand in for me because I have to attend something short for 2:30. That's all. Okay.
Well,
I'm not asking you to change it. I just enough.
I realize that I'm still waiting for the applicant for the matter that I was going to have heard first, and he's not in yet. So, Mr. Chair, are you prepared to open the meeting, and maybe we'll move the other application up first?
I am.
Okay, then I think we'll open, and hopefully Sean will be able to join in. So I leave it to you, Mr. Chair, to open.
Good day, everybody. I believe we have with us today Mr. Greco, Ms. McGregor. I believe we also have Mr. Galazzi, and I don't see, oh, there's Sean. And Sean has now joined us. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the Committee of Adjustment. And Michelle, do you want to go through the, sorry?
Today we'll have Jonathan Kirkell, planning staff, and Peter Tenazza will be joining in as well. So I'd like to confirm that we have a quorum in attendance. As a matter of fact, we have all members. Member Greco has notified me that he has a direct pecuniary interest in application A1821, which is tab 1 on your agenda. He's a property owner, so when we consider that, he will mute out the hearing when we bring that matter to the floor. I need a motion for the minutes for April 28th, being that May 12th meeting was canceled, so I need a motion for the minutes for May 28th.
I will move.
Or April 28th, I'm sorry.
I will move.
Moved by Art, second by Joe.
Yep.
All in favor?
Just raise your hand, thank you.
Confirmed?
I've had no requests for a withdrawal or deferral. So, and I'm waiting for, Mr. Tenazza has joined us, but Mr. Kirkell has left the room. Let's move right, Member Greco, we'll move right to item 1, which is your item of pecuniary interest, and deal with that, and then we won't have to have you leave or disconnect for anything else.
I'll take off until you're ready for me.
Thanks, Joe.
Okay, thank you. So this is application A1821. It's an application from Matthew DeRue, Gary Trembinski, and Joseph Greco at Civic number 859 Pine Street. The property is located on the southwest corner of Tilley Road and Pine Street. It is designated residential in the official plan and is zoned R2 single unit residential. Relief is requested from the provisions of bylaw 2005-150 as amended to facilitate the establishment of an accessory use second unit by reducing the required lot area. Specifically, sections 4.15.7.1 and 9.6.2 of bylaw 2001-50 requires a lot area of 550 square meters. The applicant seeks to reduce the required lot area to 536 square meters. Notice of public hearing was sent by personal mail to neighboring properties and by posting a sign on site. There's no public attending the hearing. As part of the application review, this proposal was circulated to internal departments and external agencies for their review. There were no comments or concerns raised that would preclude this application from moving forward. Legal and fire services had no comment or objection to the application. Planning staff support the creation of second units when no land use impacts are present. They have no objections to this application, and there were no other objections. Mr. Chair, those are my submissions.
Thank you. Any questions from any of the board members?
Mr. Chairman, this is pretty straightforward. I will move
Seeing there are none, thank you, Art. A second by someone, please.
I will second it.
Thanks, Melinda. All in favor? Confirmed?
Thank you.
Will we bring Mr. Greco back on?
Yes, we'll bring Mr. Greco back on, please. There he is. Okay, so if I could have the committee's indulgence, we'll move to tab 10 on your agenda. And that would be an application from Frost Developments, application A1221. And Mr. Nacarado, agent for the application, is in attendance, and as well as Mr. Dolcetti, who is representing the neighboring property owners. The application is A1221. Frost Developments Inc. is the owner of Civic 550 Queen Street East. It is located on the north side of Queen Street East between James Street and Carmen's Way. It is designated residential in the official plan and is zone C4 S50 general commercial with a special exception. Relief is requested from the provisions of bylaw 2005-150 as amended by reducing the required perimeter buffering to include the existing trees only, save and except adjacent to 540 Queen Street West. Specifically, section 4.9A of bylaw 2001-50 and of the general commercial exception S50. Buffer requirements are maintain a planting strip along the full extent of the common boundary where non-residentially zoned lots abuts residentially zoned lots or A, B, or C. The applicant seeks to reduce the planting strip or perimeter buffering to the existing trees only, save and except along the common boundary between the subject property and civic number 540 Queen Street West. Section 4.9 buffer requirements in its entirety. When a non-residentially zoned lot abuts a residential or rural zone lot, the non-residentially zoned lot shall provide and maintain a planting strip along the full extent of the common boundary of such lots, or buffering may be set back from the common lot line so long as no part of the non-residential use occurs on those lands between the buffer and the abutting residential lot. Such buffers are in addition to the minimum landscaping requirements outlined in each zone and shall have a minimum width of A, 0 meters wherever there is 100% visually solid fence, or at least 1.8 meters above established grade. B, 3 meters wherever there is a continuous hedgerow of evergreens, bushes, shrubs, or a berm which shall reach at least 1.8 meters above established grade upon maturity. Or C, 15 meters wherever such a strip contains existing vegetation of at least 1.8 meters above established grade that provides an effective visual buffer. Public notice was sent by personal mail and by posting a sign on site, and Mr. Dolcetti, as I mentioned, is here to speak to, will be attending or speaking to the two neighboring property owners' concerns. Daryl Betts, agent for the abutting property owners at 100 James Street and 555 Albert Street West, submitted the following comments. Attached in this document are photos that illustrate that there is no longer a visually solid fence in its current state. The owners of 100 James and 555 Albert Street West are intent on trying to improve the James Street area. However, find it difficult to sell prospective tenants on cleanliness in the neighborhood with views such as these. Given the barrier's dilapidated state, it is a liability for insurance purposes, pedestrian traffic using it as a flow through between Albert Street West and Queen Street West. Removing and not replacing the barrier will only compound the traffic that moves to and from the commercial and residential space. The owners also do their share of seasonal cleanup. However, the photos attached provide evidence that more is required from their commercial neighbor. There is great concern that this will continue if relief is granted. The bylaw requires buffer between commercial and residential spaces, and it's in place for a reason. In this case, the owners of 100 James Street and 555 Albert Street West want to ensure that a visually solid fence is in place and are strongly against the proposed variance. Jerry Dalsetti advised that he is representing Steve and Carla Persian and provide the following comments. My comments are in addition to a letter sent by Daryl Betts dated March 24th, 2021. Some of the points are similar and I have expanded on their content. It is my understanding that the minor variance application is being requested to provide relief from section 4.9 buffer requirements. Reduce the planting strip or perimeter buffering to the existing trees only, save and except along the common boundary between the subject properties and civic number 540 Queen Street West. The intent of a minor variance is to provide relief of conditions in the zoning bylaw that does not create an impact or hardship on the abutting property. Clearly, upon a recent visit to the subject's lands, it was evident that the applicant has not maintained the buffer as per zoning requirements. Maintenance of the buffer area is critical if there is any hope in creating a visual barrier. At no time does the applicant even mention rebuilding a fence. The location of the chain link fencing, albeit a deterrent, does not complement the ground vegetation to form a visually solid barrier. There is sufficient room to remove the current chain link fence that is in the state of disrepair and construct a visually solid wood fence of at least 1.8 meters above established grade along the property line. There is sufficient room so as to not impact the growth of the existing mature trees. Having a solid wood fence would be better in the event that the applicant's property may, in the future, be repurposed to another permitted commercial use in the bylaw that may not be compatible to the residential setting. Notwithstanding and speaking to Steve Persian as an option to the wood fencing, he is accepting that the applicant replaces the current fence with a new chain link fence to protect his property from trespassers. He is requesting the chain link fencing and post the industrial gauge standard. Steve Persian is very familiar with the residential, commercial, and industrial land use in our city. Upon his arrival as a developer in 1972, he began building residential properties leading to over 600 residential units. In the Jane Street area alone, he has constructed 134 units and 3 buildings. He maintains his buildings, exterior, interior, and landscaping that meet zoning and code requirements. Steve and Carla also recently invested in the area with their purchase of 544 Albert Street West. Wanting to ensure the property did not end up in the hands of a landlord that did not have a shared interest of improving the neighborhood, they have spent the last 2 years restoring this asset's value and highlighting this in conjunction with the James Street neighborhood strategy. In summary, both Steve and Carla Persia object to the request for minor variance as proposed by the applicant and are prepared to work with the owner so that replacement of the existing chain link fence be either a solid wood fence along the property line or a new chain link fence and post built to an industrial gauge standard. As part of the application review, this proposal was circulated to internal departments and external agencies for their review. There were no comments or concerns raised that would preclude this application from moving forward. The following circulated departments, divisions, and agencies had no comment or objection to the application: Building, Engineering, Legal, Fire Services, Sault Ste. Marie Region Conservation Authority, and Bell Canada Right-of-Way. Planning Division opined that the existing trees provide effective visual screening between the subject commercial property and the abutting residentially zoned properties. However, there are other matters that detract from the purposes of visual screening and that negatively impact the aesthetic quality of the area. Planning staff recommend approval of the application subject to the following: that the applicant submits a landscape plan to the satisfaction of the planning director showing tree locations, species, and size upon planting, that the applicant removes any remaining chain link fencing with the exception of the required buffering along the common boundary between the subject property and civic number 540 Queen Street West. In summary, planning staff wish to remind the applicant that it is their responsibility to ensure that going forward, the buffer along the east lot line adjacent to 540 Queen Street West is maintained in compliance with the buffering requirements of the zoning bylaw. In addition to planning's initial comments, which I just read, I would like to take this opportunity to note that in planning staff's opinion, approval of this application and the recommended conditions would meet the four tests of a minor variance, and the planner says as follows. 1, is it minor and is it desirable? Staff are of the opinion that the requested variances and recommended conditions of approval would be minor in nature and desirable for the area. Wherever possible, planning staff has taken an approach to try and maintain existing mature vegetation. While it is recognized that this may not be possible or feasible, in this case, mature vegetation surrounds much of the site. Where the vegetation is sparse, the applicant will be required to plant additional vegetation subject to the planning director's approval of a landscape plan to ensure that appropriate species of an appropriate size are planted. Much like fences, it is recognized that vegetated buffers require ongoing maintenance to ensure they remain aesthetically pleasing. It would appear that maintenance of the property, including the vegetated buffer, has been lacking, and recommended conditions of approval will require the owner to pay more attention to the ongoing maintenance of the buffer. And 2, does it meet the intent and purpose of the zoning bylaw? The buffering requirements of the zoning bylaw apply where a residentially zoned lot abuts a non-residentially zoned lot, in this case, a commercial lot. The buffering provisions require either a 6-foot visually solid fence or a 3-meter continuous hedgerow of evergreens, bushes, shrubs, or a berm, which shall reach at least 1.8 meters above established grade upon maturity. In this case, a mature vegetative area exists around the periphery of the site, excluding the southeast portion where there is a visually solid wooden fence, and the eastern and northwestern portions where the vegetation is quite thin. The intent of the buffering requirements is to limit off-site impacts such as light glare from vehicles and the additional traffic and activity generally associated with a commercial site. It is staff's opinion that the existing vegetative areas accomplish this intent, and where vegetation is sparse, additional landscaping shall be planted. Furthermore, conditions are also recommended to ensure the ongoing maintenance of the vegetative buffer. It is recognized that the neighboring property owners have concerns related to trespassing and various nefarious activities that may be occurring upon the commercial property after hours. It is worth noting that the buffering provisions of the zoning bylaw are not intended to result in a fortified compound area, and replacing of the landscape buffer with a visually solid fence would not stop people from accessing the commercial property after hours. It is also recognized from an aesthetic standpoint, one might prefer a cleaner looking fence over a more natural, organic looking, mature vegetative buffer. This is certainly a matter of personal preference, which is not contemplated by the zoning bylaw, which permits either a fence or 3-meter vegetative buffer. And 3, does it meet the overall intent and purpose of the official plan? The city's current official plan does not specifically speak to buffering requirements between commercial and residential uses. Section 2.1 of the OP includes a number of urban design policies which generally focus on streetscapes, improvements, and a high standard of site design in strategic or prominent locations such as gateway areas. The subject property is not located within a gateway area, therefore within the context of the official plan, which does not specifically address buffering, this application meets the overall intent and purpose of the OP. The applicant at one point responded as follows: "We are prepared to extend the vegetation buffer in lieu of a fence where required. This has been a recurring issue on the west side of the property as the neighbor on this side continuously piles his snow on top of the fence, causing damage. We repair the fence every spring only to have it damaged again in the winter. If you or your representative visit the site today, you can see how snow piled along and over the top of the fence line." And the committee has pictures depicting these comments that I've read so far. The applicant is in attendance and will speak further to that. Considerations for the committee: the westerly and northeasterly abutting property owners object to the request. They would prefer that the bylaw be upheld and a visually solid wood fence be constructed. However, they are prepared to accept a new industrial gauge chain link fence as an alternative to a visually solid wood fence. And planning staff are recommending conditional approval. And Mr. Chair, those are my submissions.
Thank you.
Mr. Nacarado, if you'd like to speak to the
Speak.
Yes, thank you.
and thanks everyone for allowing us to speak today. We are looking here at hopefully obtaining a conditional approval subject to a landscaping architect's plan that is under the approval of Pete Tenazzo. So that's really what we're looking to do, is to go ahead with an organic barrier through the use of trees and a vegetation plan. We do plan to retain a landscaping architect to do this plan, subject to your approval. And we do plan to allow Peter Tenazzo to essentially review the plan and then bless it before we proceed. So we are looking for a conditional approval. As stated, the issue that we've been having here at this property on the westerly side is that we do have a chain link fence on that site that has been there. A chain link fence is very strong. It's made from steel. It's much stronger than wood, and it continues to be damaged year after year, and we continue to replace it and repair it year after year. This solid steel fence is not something that can be damaged by a pedestrian. This can only be damaged by vehicles or heavy equipment, and that is what is happening here. As you can see from the photos we've provided to you, and you look at the loading on the fence is all coming from the westerly side and being loaded on from the adjacent neighbor. Snow removal equipment and vehicular traffic that is impacting the fence year in and year out. After repairing the fence over and over again, we've decided to work with the city on this and work directly with Pete Tenazzo to look at what would be acceptable. And we believe that an organic buffer is in the best interest of everyone in the neighborhood, and is something that we're willing to do to the city's direction and the city's approval. Furthermore, we think a wood fence would last significantly less amount of time and be much less durable than the existing steel fence that has not been able to deal with and absorb the impacts from the snow removal from the adjacent property over and over again. We don't think a wood fence would even last one winter, given the loads that have been placed on this fence over and over again. We think that if we do go in and try to rebuild the steel fence that is there, we will, the trees will die that are there. The existing mature trees that we have on site, we will impact the roots in such a way that we would be starting from scratch again. And these mature trees that have taken us many, many years to grow will die. So we do believe that the organic buffer is the way we want to go. We're all in with using the landscaping architect to design this plan and take the right species of trees, the right mix, the right height and sizes of these species of trees to put in there. And we would be removing, just cutting the fence down in its damaged sections right to the ground level without disturbing the roots of the existing trees. As you can see from the photos, the vegetation layer is on our side of the property. After the vegetation layer is the fence. The trees have lasted and are in good order. It's the fence which is after the trees where the issue is. So that's really what we're looking for today, is a conditional approval based on a landscaping architect's plan and something that planning and Peter Tenazzo can bless. And we're hoping that we can obtain that from you today. If there's any other questions for me, please feel free to go ahead.
Committee members, any questions of Mr. Nacarado?
Or do you want to wait until Mr. Dolcetti has spoken?
Okay, we'll wait till Mr. Delcetti's spoken then. Okay, go ahead. Michelle?
Jerry, are you prepared to speak now? You must have stepped away.
Or you thought he was on mute.
Jerry, you're on mute. Can you hear me? Peter, are you able to message him?
Michelle, if I could make one more comment, would that be okay?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so when this happened after the last hearing, we did reach out.
I'm on. Am I on?
Just a minute, Mr. Nacarado, you can complete your comment.
Just to mention, after the last hearing occurred, we did reach out to Mr. Betts as well as Jerry, had some brief conversations, and when I had a very detailed conversation with Mr. Betts about this topic, we had explained our concerns to Mr. Betts, and he talked about potentially putting some small cement curbs in front of the fence and things of that nature. My conversation with him was around these snow piles that are getting piled on top of the fence. They're 10 to 20 feet high, so I didn't think a cement barrier would do much. But I did say to him, and I did offer to him, what if we, if you're really adamant on the fence here, would you split the cost of the repairs with me, seeing that it's quite obvious and quite apparent that it was your snow removal crew that caused this damage. And he said he would consider it. And I tried calling him a number of times to try to get an answer from him, and I did get no response. That was something we're willing to do, is saying, hey, it's our fence. We understand that the buffer is our responsibility, but we didn't cause the damage. Your end caused the damage. As a offer of good faith and kind of extending an olive branch here, would you split the cost with us, considering that the damage came from your snow removal equipment? And we did not get a response on that, and here we find ourselves today. But I thought that was important point to say.
Mr. Nacarado, if I could just ask for the record purposes, is that still on the table? Are you still prepared?
To split the cost of the fence? Yeah.
Just so that he is aware that.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think if that, our argument behind that is we keep spending time and resources and money fixing this fence. We do it year in and year out, and it keeps getting damaged. I really feel strongly that if the neighbor doesn't have any skin in the game in this fence, they'll continue to be damaged unless it becomes a civil matter and we, elevate it in unified civil courts, which is not something that we really want to do. And that's why we tried to pick this path, as we thought we could hopefully come up with a compromise and find a way to all work together. And again, why we proposed, if the fence is really important to you, our clients are a lot of seniors and folks like that. So the fence seemed to be much more important to our neighbor than to us. We said, we would put the fence up, but you got to have some skin in the game because you keep damaging this thing. And our hope is that if they paid for half of it, they wouldn't keep damaging it. But here we are today. So I guess you could say we're willing to do either or. We're either willing to split the cost of the fence, if they're willing to do that, and we could try to repair and put the new fence up. We may kill a couple trees along the way, which is not something we really want to do, but it is what it is. Or really get the landscaping architect to design a robust vegetation plan, work with Peter and put that up as well. So either or.
Mr. Dolcetti, would you like to speak now?
Yes, I would. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me, Michelle? Yeah. I can't hear you. Can I hear?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, that's all I needed, sir. Thank you. And certainly thank you for the opportunity of listening to the information that's been provided on this application, along with the added information provided by planning staff. One of the things that we understood was that after the first meeting, it was deferred for a second meeting, and that we were basically going to have a site plan, a landscaping plan provided by the applicant, and that we would have an opportunity to see the plan. We found out that obviously after talking to Michelle, that there was no plan that was prepared. And I thought that was one of the conditions for coming back, and the individual needed to have some time to prepare. But regardless, it would have been nice to have so that we could actually see what was actually happening prior to formal approval of this application.
If I could stop you there for a minute, Jerry, I just want to make clarification on that. both yourself and Mr. Nacarado, at the time of the first hearing, were provided with the comments from planning. And planning's comments were conditional approval, provided that those things were added as conditions. As you know, the application was deferred at that hearing.
Yes,
You're referencing, and Mr. Nacarado referenced comments that were made by planning at that time. It was not the committee that attached those. Those were comments read in the copies that I sent you fellas. The committee didn't consider the application at all.
okay, that's fine, but I thought that was communicated, the importance of having this plan. Regardless, we don't have that plan to look at now. It has to happen as what is being suggested to occur as part of approval of this application. One of the things that we wanted to bring forward was the fact that the key of the plan that is adopted has the word maintain, I'm sure, in terms of the landscaping details and the plants and so forth. We are certainly in support of having the trees remain. Those trees are iconic. They basically have a very neat state in terms of conditions. They may need some pruning, but at least the trees are there. We certainly don't want to see them removed. Secondly, as far as ground cover is concerned, and even the fence, and I'll get to the fence afterward, the ground cover, I don't think there was any maintenance done on the ground cover for the, and I understand after talking to Jason, that was about 20 years or so that they've been involved in this building and the property. And I don't see a lot of work that was done to maintain that particular landscape. Now that the trees have grown to the level they have, obviously they create a shade. And I've got some experience in my own home to see what happens when these trees have casted a shade. You don't really get a lot of growth, and you could have some growth, but nothing that could possibly grow to a point where it forms a formal barrier. And that is where we sort of said, okay, fine. The intent of having some sort of a buffer there probably is better by way of a wood fence, or in the case of a chain link fence, there's an opportunity to see that particular kind of structure on the site and just introduce some trees or small trees or whatever it is. The problem with not having the fence there is the traversing of people and whatever else happens in that area. And it's mentioned in the staff's comments of going through that area. And that is not going to happen. That is going to happen if you're just going to put plant material and hope for it to grow. But the key word here is maintain, and that was never maintained as far as we understand. Now, my client has been at this for about 2 years trying to get something to happen with regards to cleanup of the area to begin with. And I understand that that's been very frustrating, probably on both sides. But in the case of my client, he has actually been as open as possible as to what possibly could happen. And again, this is part of the city's responsibility in carrying out maintenance, making sure that maintenance has been an activity that's had some history. One of the things that they were very concerned about was the fact that, yes, there was damage that was made on the chain link fencing. And I also indicated that it appeared to be a snowplow or whatever. And I know that it's not the only one that had snow accumulating along the fence. Also, the applicant's abutting neighbor has pushed snow on the other side of the fence. And I guess I don't want to get into a fencing argument, but the whole idea of the fence is not to make sure that if it is maintained, it's maintained properly. I know the applicant ended up repairing a couple of sections, but it wasn't really a repair job. It was sort of a minor change because a lot of the fencing just didn't match. So we have all this buffer requirements, and what's happened is we're faced with a very difficult situation. I know that in talking to Steve, as well as other staff members that have occupied the building, they would like to see something cleaned up on the site because it isn't very aesthetically pleasing. So from the standpoint of where we're at, we see ourselves in a case of there is an application, there is a bunch of recommendations which are being asked of, and there needs to be some clarity as to what happens if there isn't the maintenance of the vegetation. What happens if there are issues that surface? And that is very important because, we don't know what basically can happen with this particular piece of property. It may sell, it might be for sale down the road, and there could be conditions that the initial purchaser buying the property has to know about. There has to be some accountability with regards to seeing that at the end of the day, the property is maintained, but at the end of the day also, if it's owned by another owner, that owner is properly acknowledged as to what has occurred and what conditions that owner or new owner would have to use in order to make this project more meaningful. One of the things I know that the city's really looking at is trying to help out the James Street area in terms of getting it to look more like a community rather than what it looks right now. So the introduction of added vegetation is very good. But I think at the end of the day, even though it's a condition in one of the requirements by staff, planning staff, that if the vegetation is not maintained, that a wood fence would have to be built. And in that regard is where we have this particular issue. What sort of condition, what sort of timing is being put in place here? How long is it going to take for the applicant to carry out some of these improvements? And is there a way of making sure legally that the applicant abides by all those conditions? And I think from that standpoint, it'll give us a better feel. I think that's about everything I'd like to add at this stage. There is the question with regards to the kind of damage that was done, and I think we covered that. But I wanted to let you know that Mr. Persia also had gone into the building of the applicant to see if there was anything that he can talk about the issues with regards to the fence. And this is some time ago. However, had not gotten any response back. So I'm left with a bit of a void in terms of making sure that we are going to end up at the end of the day having a project that will be accepting by both sides. I did have a conversation with Steve with regards to the conditions, but also had a discussion with Daryl as to what Jason had mentioned as a conversation that they had. And they feel that the majority of the problem lies with Jason in the way he's handled this site versus them in terms of what they've done, in terms of making their building look attractive, their landscaping be attractive. And so they don't feel that it would be their obligation to have to sort of split the cost. And at this stage, we don't even know what that cost is. So we don't have a feel for even a discussion on it to the extent that we probably should have if a decision's to be made. So those are sort of my comments. We certainly would like to see the chain link fence or the wood fence if it means, and if costs are less one or the other, then obviously that would help us in both ways. So If there are any questions that you want to ask, I certainly will try to answer them, and we can go from there.
Peter, do you have anything you want to add at this point? Or,
Maybe very briefly, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. I think our comments speak for themselves. This is a difficult application. And from a planning standpoint, we always proceed on the basis that if there's a mature vegetation, we try to maintain that vegetation, recognizing that mature vegetation is not a hard line like a fence, so people can still go through it. And mature vegetation isn't necessarily, and certainly in this case, is not 100% visually solid. So we recognize that. And I guess three other things that we recognize here. First, we do recognize that maintenance of the site appears to have been lacking over the years. When you visit the site, I think you can kind of see that for yourself. We also recognize that, like, aesthetically, an organic vegetated buffer versus that clean sort of look of a fence can be a matter of personal preference. We recognize that. And finally, we recognize that, ultimately it's the neighbors on either side that are most impacted by this. So we do recognize those three things. If I could just, I think I'll respond to a couple things that Mr. Dulcetti has said. And maybe it's more of a question and a comment. Am I right to understand that maybe there's a potential agreement here that the applicant and or the neighbors would be willing to agree to a chain link fence without the buffer? To that end, like, I don't know that planning, we would support that, because as I mentioned in the comments, the reasoning for the chain link fence is to provide the reasoning for the buffering is to provide a visual screen. The vegetation, although not 100% visually screened, it does provide a visual screen. A chain link fence with no vegetation provides no visual screen. So we sort of look at it from the stand, and I seem to feel as though my take, and again, I'm not an arborist, I'm not a landscape architect, my sense is that replacing and putting a new fence would impact some or a lot of those trees. And my understanding is that a fence contractor would likely go in and say, you got to remove all these trees and then we'll put the fence in. If you try to do it the other way around, then you've got a dead tree that now we've got to cut and those kinds of things. So really and truly, it's the trees go wooden fence as per the bylaw, or we work something through the middle, which is what planning staff is recommending, in that the applicant put together a site plan to the satisfaction of the planning director. And in so doing, where the thin spots exist, we can plug in additional vegetation, again, recognizing that this probably won't result in that 100% visual screen that you'll get from the wooden fence. And then finally, there was a lot of talk about the maintenance. I do note that our original comments, we did have an additional condition that I didn't hear Michelle read out, and I'll read what it was. That the applicant regularly cut and maintain the grass, and that additional trees be planted to fill the existing gap. And then it goes on to talk about where some of those existing gaps are. So I want to say it's not just about handing us a landscaping plan that says, okay, there's 6 spruce trees here and 4 some other type here. What it really is handing us a landscape plan that not only shows the existing trees, but shows where those gaps exist and where some of those gaps and what tree species at what side would be planted within those gaps. So those are my comments. And if anybody has any questions, I'm certainly available. Thank you.
Okay, Peter, I'm sorry, Michelle, through Michelle. Can I ask a question of Peter with regards to the plan?
you certainly can. I mean, Mr. Chair, I think you're prepared to have Mr. Nacarado or Mr. Tenazzo ask a question.
I am. I was sure.
Well,
I was gonna. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jay.
Sorry, my only thing was there was a couple of points that both Pete made and Jerry made that I was just wondering, would I have an opportunity just to comment on, because they just involved some of the things that we were saying.
Would would board members like to ask Jay or Mr. Dulcetti some questions in order? Anyone?
I think that would be proper, Mr. Chair.
Okay, anyone would like to ask I would like to start if I could, Michelle.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
I'm going to return to Mr. Nacarado if I could. I understand Mr. Nacarado's concern with continuously having to fix something. Just a quick question, Mr. Nacarado. The age of the existing fence, how old, may I ask, is that?
I believe it was put in when Algoma Steel bought the property. I believe they put it in at that point in time, which was the mid 80s.
Okay,
And then certain sections were repaired along the way, but I think that was the original installation of the fence.
And I certainly understand your concern with continuously having it being damaged and be repaired. So I think if it's at all possible, this is my own comment before I open up to the other board members, that the working with the other neighboring parties would be the best. And I understand your concern. If someone put money into something that, you know what I mean, they would likely not damage it. So I don't know if that's still available.
Yeah.
I know you put that up. I think that's important. I think that would also, to some degree, on Mr. Dulcetti's side, you know, they would get a fence of perhaps, or some, you know, part landscape and fence with vegetation. I think, you know what I mean, if the issue there is, I think Mr. Dulcetti's trying to figure out where would the costs be? How do I go back and ask where these costs are? We don't have something in front of us today with the application. That's my only comments.
Yeah, we did get quotes on that. So we
Okay.
have the cost to replace the section on the westerly side, would be about just under $20,000 to replace the fence on that side. And as Peter had suggested, you know, the trees, the existing mature trees there do become an issue to do that. And
Right.
as Peter had indicated, the contractor is basically verbatim saying what Peter already said. From our perspective, we're ready to invest in the property, but we don't want to spend good money after bad and replace an asset that keeps getting destroyed every year. And hence why we're asking for some, if the individual damaging the fence has some skin in the game and pays for part of that fence, we think that is a good deterrent and helping them to manage their snow removal contractor so that it doesn't get damaged again. And we're happy to work together. We are ready to invest in the property. We're ready to invest in this buffer, but we certainly don't want to spend good money after bad on a fence that continues to get damaged by snow removal.
I understand. Thank you. Other committee members, questions of Mr. Nacarado?
Chair, I would like to talk to Peter. Peter, I was involved when they put the wood fence in on Tenera Steel at Algoma Steel. That's a good many years ago. It was a blessing to all the neighbors that were along Wallace Terrace. That was the biggest argument with Algoma Steel, that thing with the noise on the other side and the buffering. That fence is still there. And it's a wooden fence. If a couple slats were broken, they just repaired them. I'm not talking about whether it's a wooden fence or a steel fence, or I know one thing, Peter. You representing the city. We're putting a lot of money in the West End every year, trying to beautify it, trying to get it up. Whatever you do with this property, it's got to be done right. It's got to be done right with the satisfaction. And I always like to have both parties agree to what's going to be done. You know, the snowplow can break this. Looking at this fence, it just didn't happen yesterday. That fence has been deteriorated for years. So as a board member, if we're going to vote on anything, it's got to be on something that's going to be mutually agreed and it's going to be right for both parties. Because we're spending all kinds of money in the West End. And every time you hear a debate in City Hall, well, we got to beautify it, got to do it. There's an opportunity here with both owners to do something that's going to be respectable for the residents and the people of that area. I don't know what your comments on that, Peter, but I'd be happy to hear you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Golotsi. A couple things. I guess it's a matter of personal preference, right? So Some people would prefer the cleaner look of a fence, and others would prefer the more organic look of the mature vegetation. As far as, one comment to make on the chain link fence that we're talking about that's been damaged. I should note that's only a small portion of the chain link fence that surrounds the property. I don't want to hazard a guess. Maybe it's 20%, maybe less of the entire portion of property that is bound by a chain link fence. I wouldn't suggest that chain link is more or that a wooden fence is more susceptible to damage than a chain link fence. I think ultimately where you have snow being, and this happens throughout the community, I'm sure we've all driven by fences that we see leaning one way and they're generally beside a parking lot. This does happen quite a bit. Ultimately that becomes a civil matter between the two. I don't know that I would agree that fence versus no fence is like the whole discussion and decision should be based upon the fact that a very small portion of that fence has gotten damaged by the removal of snow. Whether it was chain link or wood, I think the impact would be the same. I think when you look at other parts of the fence, you can tell, for example, on the eastern side, you can see a spot where at some point I'm thinking somebody cut a hole in it so that they could maybe go from one apartment building through the subject property to another, and that hole has been patched. So they're both styles of fence are susceptible to damage. For us, wood provides that 100% visually solid screen. So if it was going to be, we're not going to go with the landscaping, we're going to go with a fence, we would request that it be wood. And I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but.
Thank you very much.
I may comment.
Go ahead, Joe.
So I've listened to everything here, and I've listened to Mr. Galazzi and Mr. Tenazzo. They make good points, along with Mr. Nacarado. I'm tending to agree with Mr. Tenazzo. A chain link fence there, that's not going to solve this problem. People cut holes in them all the time, and that's from my experience, both as a business owner downtown with property and seeing other properties. They cut holes in fences. Happens all the time. If anything's going to happen, it's either got to be the wood or it's got to be the vegetation. But even a wood fence, to keep people out is very tough. And I know the comments from our city folks. The bylaw does not contemplate a fortified compound, a citadel or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't contemplate that. So if it's going to be anything, you need to have wood or you need to have vegetation. Now we get to Mr. Nacarado's issue with the snow removal. That becomes a civil matter. So if there's a wood fence and it gets damaged, my understanding as a lawyer, he'll have a statement of claim that he'll be able to issue against the neighbors for damaging his fence. So Mr. Dolcetti, do your neighbors want that liability? Because I'm sure Mr. Nacarado would do that. If his fence keeps, I know I would sue them. So the wood fence, obviously, from a planning perspective, it provides that visual screen, but it puts the neighbors in a legal liability situation for damage and their snow removal contractors. Whereas the natural vegetation, to add on to that with the architectural landscaper, seems to avoid a lot of those problems. So in my opinion, a chain link fence isn't going to solve this problem. It's either wood or vegetation. And depending on the other comments from my fellow board members, I think I can make a pretty good decision here.
Other board members? Questions?
Anthony?
Yes, go ahead, Sean.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just have a question for, I believe it would be for Mr. Dolcetti, but given that the neighboring properties are apartment buildings, we've heard from the property owner, but I'm curious if any of the actual residents of those buildings have complained directly about trespassing directly from the abutting property. And if that would be impacted by a physical barrier, considering that, you know, it's not a large area that we're talking about here.
As far as a response, I do not know if there's been some conversation between the people living in the apartment building and their wishes one way or another, or any issues that have surfaced. I do know that having a wood fence was something that my client was quite prepared to accept, because again, it's the question of landscaping, the maintaining of that landscaping area. And it's very difficult. And it also agrees that the chain link fence is the way of that barrier, but it doesn't look as good as let's say, a wood fence or an area that gives it greater aesthetics. And I think at this stage, I really can't answer that.
So I don't have any further questions. I think that, you know, I would, I yield the floor to whatever the next step in the process is.
Thank you. Any other board members have any questions? Okay. I guess my last comment will be, before we kind of put it to the board members, is do you believe, Mr. Nacarado and Mr. Delcetti, that both your clients could work it out with a solution that would satisfy both of you?
If I can respond, please. Yes, I think there is an opportunity, and I think that certainly when I was asked about the opportunity to do something, I said, let's have a meeting with both sides and see if we can gain anything in terms of support to come across and carry forward a solution to it. From my perspective, I would certainly appreciate that. I know that it's always been difficult, and even in the experience that I've had working with the city as a planner, to get two sides together and go through a process of understanding and come up with a balanced approach is somewhat difficult. But I certainly feel that both sides can provide info, and at the end of the day, that could possibly be the total solution to this.
Yeah, and if I could comment, I mean, I feel that I have a pretty good working relationship with Jerry. I'd be happy to work with him on that. I think that if we were to be, you know, putting forward a landscaping plan, and Jerry, just to comment on your comment previous, the reason why the landscaping plan isn't designed right now, because we came into this meeting not knowing if it was going to be build a fence and take down all the trees, in which case that would have been spending money on a plan that would really have no purpose. So we're willing to invest, we're willing to go get a plan, we're willing to consult with Jerry and Mr. Butts on the plan, and then of course work through Peter and the planning department to get it kind of agreed upon by everyone. We're willing to do that, and hopefully that's something that the neighbors would be satisfied with, and that we can all have some input into the plan and come up with something that would hopefully work for everyone. In regards to the wood fence, I'm much more fearful of a wood fence than I am the chain link fence, just because of the durability and robustness of the wood fence, in our opinion, with the amount of loading that happens on that area, because it is right up against the parking lot. We would be really worried about putting a wood fence in that particular location, because the steel fence just didn't last. So we don't think the wood fence would have a chance. But we're happy to work with everybody, including Jerry and his side, and planning to put together a vegetation plan that everyone can be happy with.
Thank you. Michelle?
Well, I think that the committee will have to be careful in their wording of their approval. While mutual agreement between all parties is naturally, they all roll. I think that if the committee is moving in that vein, your approval and conditions attached to that approval need to give the planning director some ability to make the decision whether Mr. Nacarado agrees or whether Mr. Dulcetti agrees. The primary would be that the planning director feels that what's finally brought forward is appropriate.
As the oversight, yeah.
Yeah, I can agree to that because we don't necessarily want to be in a situation where we're just going back and forth with each other. I think somebody has to have the decision-making ability, and it would make sense for the neutral party and the planning director to have that.
Mr. Chairman, if that's the case, why do we even have to make a decision? Why do we defer it? As Mr. Nacarado said, he's willing to meet with Jerry Dulcetti and the planning board and let them discuss what they want to do, come up with some solution and bring it back to this committee, and we can make a decision at that time. I would think that's the proper way to go, and I would be prepared to move a resolution that we defer to a meeting with Peter Tenazzo, Mr. Nacarado, Mr. Dulcetti, and whoever else is involved, and let them put their good heads together and come up with a solution that's going to be agreeable to both, and bring it back to this committee, and we'll go from there.
Michelle?
I move that resolution, Mr. Chairman.
There's a motion on the floor, so the committee needs to.
Yeah, be dealt with first, yeah. Comments from you, Michelle, though?
With all due respect, my only concern with that is the matter of maintenance of this property is in building's hands and is under order now. And delaying getting these things moving sooner rather than later could be detrimental to Mr. Nacarado. And I just throw that out.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Nacarado? Michelle's comment?
Yeah, I mean, we're just looking for direction, really. I'm in a bit of a situation where, you know, are we going to go do a bunch of maintenance on trees, or are we going to go do a bunch of maintenance on the fence? You know, we're just looking for direction. If we can agree that it's a vegetation plan we're going to go ahead and do, then we're going to go ahead and remove the sections of the fence that's in disrepair, and we're going to start maintaining the trees. But if it's the other way around, then we're going to start cutting down the trees and in preparation to build a new fence. It's like I said, we are happy to invest in that section. We're not disputing that section does not need work. We're agreeing that it needs work. We're agreeing that it needs investment, but I do need direction in order to deploy our time and resources and money and investment into the right area. So happy to just let's pick a point and pick a direction and move forward with it.
Thank you. Joe? Mr. Greco?
I know Mr. Galatzi's motion is on the floor, but I am prepared to make a motion.
On the existing?
Not on Mr. Galatzi's, on making a decision.
Right, okay.
So, Mr. Chair, is there a seconder for the motion that's on the floor?
Mr. Chairman,
I'll ask.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask Mr. Nacarado before you vote on that, is 2 or 3 weeks till our next meeting detrimental to you, that you could meet with the parties involved?
I just add there, Mr. Chair, that there's no way that Mr. Nacarado would be able to have that landscape plan in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Right.
We both have professionals out there doing it. And I think, Peter, you'd agree with that?
I'd just like to raise a point of order. Is there a seconder for the motion on the floor?
I was just going to ask that of anyone. So Joe, are you willing to move
Yes. I'm ready to move. I'm ready to make a motion. Let me get my. I'm gonna make a motion that and it's gonna follow the planning staff's recommendations.
No.
Yes.
There's no seconder for that motion, so the motion fails.
Yeah.
Need
No.
Yeah.
The Zoom stuff makes it hard. Okay.
Yeah.
Are we ready?
We are.
Okay, so I'm gonna motion for the conditional approval that the applicant does submit a landscape plan to the satisfaction of the planning director showing the tree location, species, and the size upon planting. That the applicant removes any remaining chain link fencing with the exception of the required buffering along the common boundary between the subject property and civic number 540 Queen Street West.
Is there a seconder for Joe's motion?
I'll second. Oh, for
Thank
Sean.
you. Committee members, confirmed?
Who seconded that? I'm sorry.
Melinda
it
had
was-
it first.
Next, her hand first.
I oppose.
You oppose that?
Yes.
I'll confirm.
So I need an all in favor
I confirmed, I'm in.
or? Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, can I just make a suggestion for an advisement on that?
Sure.
The motion is in and approved and the condition is there, that that the committee strongly recommends that the planning director invite both the applicant and the neighbor into discussions.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Dolcetti and Mr. Nacarado, we're finished with your request.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you.
I see we have Matt Horvatuk on, so could I bring the committee's attention to tab 8 and tab 9. Now, Mr. Horvatuk, I know that you're here on tab 9 and but we need to hear tab 8 first, so which is the Algoma Tubes application. So
Okay.
We'll hear tab 8, Algoma Tubes, and then we'll move right to your request.
Sounds good. Thanks, Michelle.
If I could bring the committee's attention to tab 8. It's application B1421, Algoma Tubes Inc., 547 Willis Terrace is the applicant. The subject property is designated industrial in the official plan and is zoned M4 heavy industrial. The applicant is seeking the committee's consent to sever a 0.3 meter by 0.3 meter square parcel at the northwest corner of the subject property and convey it as an addition to the city right-of-way. The intent of the application is to undo a previous consent, being application B27 2000, in order that the proposed conveyance described in application B1521 can attach to the subject property as a lot addition. Notice of public hearing was issued by personal mail and by posting a sign on site. It was also on the city website. The following circulated departments, divisions, agencies did not comment or had no comment or objection to this application. Building, Planning, Fire Services, and Bell Canada right-of-way. Sault Ste. Marie Region Conservation Authority advised that the proposed severance is not within the regulated area. Sault Ste. Marie Region Conservation Authority does not object to the request, and they're speaking to that little square of property is not in their regulated area. Considerations for the committee, there's no objections from neighboring property owners or staff. Again, this is just a small piece to undo a previous consent, and that small piece will be conveyed to the city as part of the street right-of-way. And those are my submissions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Board members, any questions, concerns? Mr. Horvatuk?
That's not a matter that I'm able to speak to as I'm not counsel for that applicant.
Well, my apologies then. Board members, any questions?
None.
Sean?
No, I said none.
Oh, sorry. Committee, how do we say then? Do you have a mover? Thank you, Joe. Seconder?
I'll second.
Thanks, Sean. In favor? Confirmed.
Moving on to tab 9 on your agenda, and this is where Mr. Horvatuk is acting for the applicant. The application is B1521. Algoma Steel Inc. is the registered owner of 105 West Street, an infield address of 301 Wallace Terrace. The subject property is designated industrial in the official plan and is zoned M4 heavy industrial. The applicant is seeking the committee's consent to sever a parcel having a frontage of 230 square meters more or less on Wallace Terrace, having an irregular depth and being approximately 21,190 square meters in size, and convey it to the westerly abutting property known as 547 Wallace Terrace, the Algoma Tubes property. The intent of the application is to transfer ownership of the existing industrial storage building to its current tenant, being Algoma Tubes Inc. Notice of public hearing was issued by personal mail and by posting a sign on site and posted on the city website. The following circulated departments, divisions, agencies did not comment or had no comment or objections to this application. They were building, planning, fire services, and Bell Canada right-of-way. Building staff wish to advise the applicant that there are various building permits for the subject lands that have not been finalized and recommend that any approval be conditional upon all permits related to the proposed severed parcel and structures contained thereon be finalized. Staff wish to encourage the applicant to take the necessary steps to have any other outstanding matters concluded. Sault Ste. Marie Region Conservation Authority advised that the proposed severance is within the regulated area. Any development on the severed property will require a site plan review and may require a permit by Sault Ste. Marie Region Conservation Authority. Considerations for the committee: there were no objections from neighboring property owners or staff. Recommendation is approval be conditional upon providing the secretary treasurer with written acknowledgement from the chief building official or his designate that any building permits associated with the structures on the proposed severed parcel have been finalized. In addition to that condition would be the normal conditions for a lot addition. And those are my submissions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Michelle. Sorry, Mr. Horvatuk. Any comments?
No comments, just wish to echo the building permits only on the severed parcel. Those would be the ones that would be easier to deal with on this one. And beyond that, I believe Michelle had covered off everything quite well.
Thank you, sir. Questions from committee members to Mr. Horvatuk? None?
On here.
I'll move.
I'll move. Thank you, Joe. Second?
I'll second, just based on the permits for the proposed severed parcel have been finalized.
I agree
Thank
with
you.
that.
Thank you. What do we say? Confirmed? Sean? Thank you.
Thank you, everybody on that one. And now we
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
So we'll move to tab 2 in your agenda. That would be the application from David and Geraldine Leclerc, and I see Mr. Leclerc is online with us. The civic property is 637 Sunnyside Beach Road. It is designated rural area in the official plan and is zoned R1 estate residential. The intent of the application is to seek relief from the provisions of bylaw 2005-150 as amended to facilitate the construction of a new 9.75 meter by 10.9 meter detached garage by permitting the gross floor area of the garage to exceed the gross floor area of the main building. Section 9.8.1 specifically calls for gross floor area of an existing main building is 62.25 square meters. The applicant seeks to increase the permitted gross floor area for the proposed garage to 108 square meters. Notice of public hearing was sent by personal mail to neighboring properties and by posting a sign on site. No public other than the applicant at the hearing. Legal, fire services, and Algoma Public Health had no comment or objections to the application. Building staff wish to remind the applicant that a building permit is required. Planning staff had no objections, noting that the gross floor area of a garage on the subject property is limited given the small size of the main building. They have no objections to the proposed increase. Staff support the request, and there's no objections to date. Those are my submissions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Michelle. Mr. Leclerc, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, nothing at this time. Thank you.
Committee members, any questions?
I will move approval.
Thank you. Art, second? Thanks, Sean. What do we say? Confirmed? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Leclerc.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Tab 3, moving to tab 3, the application A 2017. 1425062 Ontario Limited is the owner of Civic number 89 Foster Drive, currently Montana's restaurant next door to the Civic Center. It is designated commercial in the official plan and is zoned C3 riverfront commercial and is subject to site plan control. Relief is requested from the provisions of the bylaw to facilitate the construction of a new 6.85 meter by 10 meter open rear deck and a 4.87 meter by 12.2 meter addition to the existing open rear deck by permitting both decks to project to the rear property line. Specifically, section 4.2 of zoning bylaw 2005-150 says that a deck may project to within 3 meters of a rear lot line. The applicant proposes to increase the permitted projection to the rear lot line. Notice of public hearing was sent by personal mail to neighboring properties by posting a sign on site and posting on the city website. No comments came in from those postings. Planning and Fire Services had no comment or objection to the application. Building staff advised that the proposed addition to the existing deck will provide additional seating for our guests. An architect will need to review the existing restaurant and decks and provide calculations to ensure that the new seating capacity will not exceed the current washrooms provided for use by the patrons. The calculations provided by the architect will also be required for the updating of the current liquor license with the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario. And that's simply for information and advisement, information to the committee, advisement to the applicant. Legal department advised that they're in the process of renegotiating a non-binding agreement, in their opinion, for the use of 89 Foster Drive of both the north and south parking lots benefiting 99 Foster Drive. We understand that these overflow spots are required to meet the required parking for 89 Foster per the zoning bylaw on the basis of permitted occupancy. Legal is operating under the assumption that increased seating would impact the required parking and would suggest that this furthers the need to revisit the agreement. Planning could best confirm if this is the case, however. Either way, we believe that completing the agreement renegotiations is an important consideration. Sault Ste. Marie Region Conservation Authority advised that the subject property is located in an area under the Conservation Authority direction with regard to Ontario Regulation 17606, development interference with wetlands and alterations to shoreline and water courses. The proposed development of decks on the subject property will require a permit from the Conservation Authority. Considerations, no objections to date. Building Division and Conservation Authority comments are for the information of the applicant. Legal department suggests that as a condition, the applicant must satisfy Building Division that the required parking spaces can be provided, and that the city legal department has been satisfied with parking agreement negotiations. I would say, Mr. Chair, that there does not need to be any condition related to satisfying Building Division regarding the required parking spaces, because if it doesn't, there'll be no building permit issue. That will come under the purview of their review of the building permit. With regard to legal department and the parking agreement negotiations, the legal department has asked that completing the agreement is an important consideration, and they would like the committee to consider that. And those are my submissions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Michelle. Committee members, any questions or comments? condition with respect to the parking? Are we going to add that as part of the application?
We could add that as the condition of approval, that legal department be satisfied with the parking arrangements. And I wouldn't say current, I would just say parking arrangements, if that's what you're thinking of.
Correct. How do we say? A mover? Anyone want to move it with the condition?
I'll move,
Thanks,
I'll move with that condition.
Thank you. Seconded?
I'll second it.
Thank you. All in favor? Confirmed?
Thank you. Moving on to tab 4, and that would be application A2121, an application from Marie McKay at 178 Woodward Avenue. The property is designated residential in the official plan and is zoned R2 single unit residential. The intent of the application, the applicant is requesting that the committee authorize a minor variance to permit an expansion to the uses and structures that existed on the property on October 25th, 2005, to include the construction of a 2.77 meter by 8 meter kitchen extension, a 3 meter by 4.26 meter covered rear deck addition, and partial roof replacement maintaining the existing legal non-conforming 6.7 meter rear yard and the 0.2 meter north side yard. Whereas zoning bylaw 2005 prohibits the use of land, building, and structures except for a use lawfully in existence on or before the day the bylaw came into force, which was October 26, 2005, and does not permit an expansion of such use, building, or structure in this instance. Notice of public hearing was sent by personal mail, posting a sign on site in the city's website. As part of the application review, this proposal was circulated to internal departments and external agencies for their review, and there were no comments or concerns raised that would preclude the application moving forward. Fire services had no comment or objection. Building staff advised that based on the data provided, the existing walls that are approximately 8 inches from the interior side yard will be extended and may require upgrading or protection in accordance with 9.10.15 of the Ontario Building Code. The proposed kitchen addition will be located greater than 4 feet from the property line and may have openings in compliance with 9.10.15 of the Ontario Building Code. The existing kitchen window, which will become the washroom, may be replaced without additional protection as the size of the opening will remain the same. Planning staff will find that the proposed expansion is similar in use to what existed prior to the 2005 zoning bylaw. No land use impacts are anticipated from the approval of this application. Staff have no objections. No objections to date. Building Division and Conservation Authority comments are simply for the information of the applicant. And those are my submissions, Mr. Chair. In my opinion, there's no request for additional conditions.
Thank you. Any questions, committee members? Could I have a mover? Thanks,
I'll
Sean.
move.
Second. Thanks, Melinda. How do we say confirmed? Thank you.
Moving on to tab 5, an application B921, an application from Benjamin Lajoie, 28 Raymond Street. The subject property is designated residential in the official plan and is zoned R2 single unit residential. The applicant is seeking the committee's consent to sever an easterly strip of property being approximately 9.6 square meters and convey it to the easterly abutting property being Civic number 24 Raymond Street as a lot addition. The intent of the application is to have final consent replace the existing declaration of possession. Notice again was sent by mail, posting a sign on site and on the city website. No comments from the public were provided. The following circulated departments had no comment or objection: Building, Planning, Engineering, Fire Services, Conservation Authority, and Bell Canada right-of-way. No objections from neighbor property owners or staff. And those are my submissions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Michelle. Anyone, any questions, concerns with the application? Have a mover?
Pretty straightforward. Chairman, I will move.
Thank you, Art. Seconder? Thanks, Joe. How do we say confirmed? Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to tab 6, an application B1021. Applicant Pause to Remember Pet Crematorium is the registered owner of 822 McNabb Street. It is located on the north side of McNabb Street, approximately 85 meters west of its intersection with Black Road. It is designated industrial in the official plan and is zone M3, S300 heavy industrial with a special exception. The applicant is seeking the committee's consent to sever a 0.3 meter by 0.3 meter square parcel at the northwest corner of the subject property and convey it to civic number 800 McNabb Street. The intent of the application is to undo a previous consent being B2214 in order that the proposed conveyance described in application B1121 can attach to the subject property as a lot addition. Again, public notice was issued by personal mail, posting a sign on site in the city website. The following circulated departments had no comment or objections: Planning, Sault Ste. Marie Region Conservation Authority, and Bell Canada right of way. No objections from neighboring property owners or staff. And those are my submissions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Michelle. Committee members, any questions? No? Can I have a mover?
I'll move.
Thanks, Sean. Seconder? Thanks, Joe. How do we say? Confirmed?
Thank you. Moving on to tab 7. Application B1121. Nick Cavatti and Sons is the registered owner of 800 McNabb Street. The subject property is designated industrial in the official plan and is zoned M3, S300, heavy industrial with a special exception. The applicants are seeking the committee's consent to sever an interior parcel of the subject property being approximately 0.09 hectares in size and to convey it to the rear of civic number 822 McNabb Street as a lot addition. And 822 McNabb is the property that we just undid the consent on. Again, notice was issued by personal mail and posting a sign on site and the city website. Planning, Legal, Fire, and Sault Ste. Marie Conservation Authority had no comments or objections. No objections from neighboring property owners and staff. Again, the customary conditions that are attached for a lot addition would apply, and those are my submissions, Mr. Chair.
Michelle?
I
Any
will move.
questions? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Art.
Mr.
Moved by
Gulati.
Art, second by Joe. Thank you. All in favor? Confirmed.
We've heard number 8. We've heard number 9. We've heard number 10. Mr. Chair, that ends the application.
Thank you, Michelle.
And other business, you note in your agendas, and I'll just point out that there was a copy of correspondence from the Deputy City Clerk regarding the Ombudsman's ruling on open meetings for your information. And I provided everyone with copies of the conflict of interest declaration form to be completed by members when you have a conflict and send to me, because we have to keep a registry of that. Any questions on those?
None?
Then, Mr. Chair, I think we've taken care of all the business.
Thank you. Motion to adjourn.
I'll move.
Thanks, Joe. Melinda seconded. All in favor? Thank you. Confirmed.
Thank you. Thank you, folks.
Well, thank you, Michelle.